Ever since the genre was first created, Japanese role-playing games have largely taken place not in Japan, or really Asia in general for that matter. Dragon Quest established the European medieval fantasy setting right from the get-go, and it's remained very prominent throughout the genre's entire lifespan. Of course, we would see unique iterations of this in the future involving a combination of other settings like sci-fi, steampunk, and stuff like that, but still, RPGs set in Asian culture-inspired fantasy worlds were pretty few and far between. Oftentimes, instead of the entire game taking place in Asian fantasy, there'll just be like one small Asian region or village somewhere in the world, like Wutai from Final Fantasy VII, Mizuho from Tales of Symphonia, Yafutoma from Skies of Arcadia, and yeah, I think you get the idea. And if it wasn't obvious, I'm specifically referring to ancient Asia, like feudal Japan, ancient China, and etc. There has been a rise in RPGs set in Japan in more recent years, however, they're more usually just set in modern-day Japan and, more specifically, Tokyo. With that said though, over the years we have gotten some RPGs set in ancient Asia, just not that many in comparison. To be completely honest, I sort of had to stretch the term JRPG for a couple entries on this list, but they do contain enough RPG qualities that they're close enough. Plus, I just really like the games and wanted an excuse to talk about them on the channel. I can already see some triggered comments about some of these games not being true RPGs, but you know what, I'd rather talk about some games I'm actually passionate about and truly think are great, instead of talking about some games I think are just mediocre only because they're more of a traditional RPG. For the RPG purists though, don't worry. The honorable list section will contain enough traditional RPGs to hopefully strike your fancy. The only reasons they're not on the actual list is either because I haven't played them, or I just wanted to talk about the others a bit more. Also, last thing, like our other 8 great format type videos, this list won't be ranked in any particular order. Now, with that long enough intro and exposition aside, let's dive into this list of 8 great RPGs that take place in ancient Asia. To start this list off, we have Saiyuki Journey West. Saiyuki Journey West was developed by Koei and came out for the PlayStation. And if I'm pronouncing that wrong, I apologize. Anyway, Saiyuki is a strategy tactical RPG very similar to games like Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre. In fact, graphically, the game looks near identical to Final Fantasy Tactics, just with an ancient Chinese paint job. In this game, you play as Sanzo, a young monk from China blessed with the task of delivering a sacred staff to India. In other words, going on a journey west. The title of the game, along with the plot loosely as well, is based on the Chinese classical novel Journey to the West. It doesn't follow it exactly, but it does take heavy inspiration from it, much more than other fictional stories based on the novel like, let's say, Dragon Ball. Journey to the West might just be the most popular Eastern Asian literature of all time, and is regarded as one of the 4 great classical novels in Chinese history, another 2 of which will also be mentioned in this video. When it comes to the actual story in the game, I wouldn't say it's anything incredibly amazing, but it's told well enough with some unique ideas and fantastic character design. I really like how you get the option to choose your gender at the start too. Pretty cool. Like most other strategy RPGs, battles play out over a grid-based battlefield, however, it does have some differing features that make it stand out from its peers. First of all, there's the wear system, which allows most of your party members to turn into giant beasts for several turns. Sanzo himself can't transform into anything, but he can summon special guardians, which also last for several turns. I guess these are really just the main differences, but they're pretty cool. Especially the whole wear form transformation system. It makes for a lot of cool moments. With that said, gameplay as a whole is fairly simple, so I wouldn't expect something as deep or complex as Final Fantasy Tactics. If you're looking for a fun, straightforward, pretty easygoing romp though, then this is definitely one to look into. The music is also excellent, which really helps immerse you in that ancient Chinese setting. I feel like the term hidden gem gets thrown around a lot these days, kind of watering down its meaning, but this game really is sort of one. It's a game I never hear people talk about, and might be one a lot of you haven't even heard of. Overall, it's a pretty solid strategy RPG, and well worth checking out. Coming up next, we have the entire Tengai Makyō series, otherwise known as Far East of Eden. quite possibly the biggest JRPG franchise not to make it out of Japan, and maybe even in video games in general. This series is absolutely massive, so I'm only gonna focus on a few of the more notable entries, including a couple that do have English fan translations. Man, where to begin? Tengai Makyō was developed by Red Company, published by Hudson Soft, and has came out for various systems over the years. The first Tengai Makyō game, Zaraya, or Ziria, not sure how to pronounce it, came out for the PC Engine in 1989. The story is loosely based on the Japanese folklore tale of Jiraiya. That story has inspired tons of works of fiction over the years, including a character of the same name from a somewhat popular series by the name of Naruto. Gameplay-wise, it's extremely similar to old-school Dragon Quest games. It's just set in an old traditional Japanese-like setting instead of more of a European medieval one. Being that it came out for the PC Engine though, a far more powerful system than the Famicom, Jiraiya was a lot more colorful and just more technically impressive. It had full animated scenes along with a lot of voice acting, which was definitely not the norm back then. As impressive as Jiraiya was though, it would be the next entry in the series, Manjimaru, that would really take things to the next level and put the series on the map. It shouldn't be understated just how much of a technical marvel this game was for the time. Graphics were better, animation was improved, and there was even more voice acting. In fact, based on my research into the game, at the time of its release, Manjimaru might have just been the highest production, biggest budget game to ever come out. Pretty crazy stuff for a game that never even saw the light of day outside its origin country. The story of Manjimaru follows a descendant of the Fire Clan and hero of the same name as he journeys to save the world and stop the Root Clan from resurrecting an ancient god. It takes place a few years after the events of the first game in a different part of the same world, Japan, which is just a fictionalized version of real Japan. Overall, the game was incredibly popular and received critical acclaim upon release. I've often seen it thrown in the same conversation as games like Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, and Phantasy Star 4 when speaking of classics from that generation. Hell, one of the characters even was popular enough to get his own spin-off game. Well, not really spin-off as it's set in the same universe, but just his own game I guess. Kabuki was a competent drunk womanizer and was a huge fan favorite. Think Kyle from Lunar, but zanier and way more flashier. And that's actually something you could say about the series as a whole. While the games could definitely get really serious when they needed to, in between those moments there was a lot of over-the-top, wacky Japanese humor that the country is known and loved for. Sadly, none of these first three games have yet to receive full English translations. Now you might be asking, well, why'd you just waste 3 minutes talking about them then? Well, that's a fair point, but I like talking about obscure Japanese games, and who knows, maybe the right person will see this video and be inspired to start working on it. Hey, a man can dream, can't he? With that said, let's talk about the ones you can play in English thanks to the internet. Tengai Makyō 0 for the Super Famicom is absolutely one you should check out. It's a stunningly gorgeous game and one of the prettiest ones on the entire system. It's one of the few games on my console to make use of the SPC 7110 data decompression chip, which allowed for more musical variation, more text, no repeated enemy sprites, and even an in-game real-world clock that allowed for certain events based on the time. This was really ahead of its time, no pun intended, and even predated that mechanic in games like Pokemon Gold and Silver. We talked about this specific entry a lot in our video about 8 great JRPGs that never left Japan, so if you want to hear some more details on it, that's a good one to check out. For now, let's talk about the other one you can play in English, Oriental Blue, for the GBA. At first glance, the game may just look like your average turn-based RPG, but it's anything but. It's very non-linear, allowing you to tackle most events in pretty much any order you want, which greatly affects the storyline of the game. For example, if you lose against a boss, the game will remember that, take it into account, and branch off into a different path from there. There's also multiple party members you can't get on the same playthrough, encouraging a lot of replayability. You also get to choose between a girl and a boy at the start, which changes a lot of dialogue and even where you start the game. It's just a super ambitious game overall that some people are bound to really love, especially Saga fans. This one's for you guys. The Tengai Makyō series still goes further from here, but I'm gonna end it there, as this video is supposed to be about a bunch of other RPGs and not just this series alone. And based on what we did cover though, that should be enough for you to chew on for now. The next game we have on our list is Muramasa the Demon Blade. Muramasa was developed by Vanillaware and originally came out for the Wii, however would later get a port to the Vita with additional content. I don't have that version though, or a Vita for that matter, so yeah, here we are. Muramasa is an action RPG heavily influenced by Japanese folklore and set during the Edo period. It looks and plays very similar to another one of Vanillaware's titles, Odin Sphere, just with a Japanese coat of paint, obviously. Visually, the game looks absolutely amazing and has some of the prettiest 2D graphics out there. Animations are clean, bosses are super majestic and detailed, and the backgrounds are nothing short of gorgeous. Coincidentally, the smooth controls, engaging boss fights, and stunning graphics are probably the best parts about this game. The other aspects are just okay. Exploration feels sort of limited, the story is pretty bare bones, and battle mechanics aren't super deep, so they can get a little repetitive after a while. With that said, you do get the option to play as 2 different characters, each with differing boss fights, so there is some variety and replayability there. The RPG elements in this game are fairly light, admittedly, as it kinda just comes down to gaining experience, leveling up, and upgrading weapons, but the game was marketed as an action RPG, so yeah, it's close enough for this list at least. If you're the type of person who really appreciates immersive atmospheres and fantastic art direction, even at the expense of somewhat shallow combat, then this is definitely one worth looking into. Coming up next, we have Onimusha Tactics. Onimusha Tactics was a tactical RPG, obviously, developed by Capcom and released for the Game Boy Advance. It's essentially a side spin-off of the Onimusha series, which in their main installments were more action-adventure, hack-and-slash games for the PS2. This title was their first and only foray into the tactical RPG genre, so how'd it turn out? Well, not bad. Not amazing, but not bad. It's probably not gonna blow your Pajama Sam socks off or anything, but if you're looking for a pretty simple strategy RPG to play while you listen to a podcast or watch a show or something, then this one fulfills that role quite nicely. Its portability only helps with that too. Story-wise, Onimusha Tactics is set during the Sengoku period and follows a young samurai, Onimaru, as he battles through legions of the Genma army, eventually trying to defeat their leader, Nobunaga. The story is pretty basic and isn't gonna win any awards, but it serves its purpose. When it comes to gameplay, it pretty much just plays out like your standard grid-based tactical RPG. There's a couple unique gimmicks, but nothing really that drastic, so if you've played any other strategy RPGs, you know what you're in for. The equipment system is kinda cool, I guess. Basically, you collect souls and Genma stones from your fallen opponents to forge new gear and upgrade weapons, armor, and stuff like that. As an overall game, it's super forgiving and probably one of the easiest strategy RPGs I've ever played, so I wouldn't go into it expecting Fire Emblem levels of difficulty and strategy. However, in the right context, that's not a bad thing at all. Sometimes you're not looking for a super challenging game that's gonna stress you out and cause frustration. Sometimes, all you need is a fun, easygoing experience to pass the time. And to that, my friends, this one comes recommended. The next game we have on our list is Kingdom of Paradise. When I thought of this video topic, this was one of the very first games that came to mind. It's a game I never hear anyone talk about and can literally count on one hand how many times I've heard it mentioned on the internet. Considering I think it's a pretty fun game as well, yeah, I think it's safe to say this one qualifies as a hidden gem. It was developed by Climax Entertainment and came out for the PSP. Quick side tangent, before doing research into this video, I didn't know that was the same company that also developed the cult classics Landstalker and Dark Savior, and even helped co-develop the first Shining Force game. Hell, some of that same team also went on to create the Alundra series. So yeah, if all that's not enough to instill confidence in this game, then I don't know, man, I tried. Maybe talking about the actual game in mention will help, so let's do that. In Kingdom of Paradise, you play as Shinbu, an exiled martial artist from the Seiryu clan, in a fictionalized world of feudal China. The game is heavily inspired by the wuxia fantasy genre, and yes, I absolutely watched a YouTube video before this to try to pronounce that correctly. Still think I butchered it though, it's fine. The gameplay sorta plays out like an open-world action RPG, where you travel to towns and various other locations and battle enemies between those areas. The battle system really isn't anything that groundbreaking and can get a little repetitive, but it's simple and engaging enough to still be fun. There are different scrolls that you can collect throughout the game though, which do affect your fighting style, so that's pretty cool. All in all, the battle system is just pretty average and not really the main standout of the game. Where this game truly shines is the atmosphere. I mean, shit, just look at how gorgeous the inner case art is. Right off the bat, you already know the developers really cared about artistic direction. I remember when I first saw that as a kid, I was like, damn, this looks so cool, I'm so excited to play this game. The vibe, the visuals, and music come together to create is just super comfy and is so much fun to traverse around and immerse yourself in. For being one of the earliest PSP titles, not only did the game look great back then, but I think it still holds up pretty well now. Locations are just so vibrant and beautiful, and character models look fine enough. As good as the visuals are though, the music is even better. I honestly forgot how great this OST was until I listened to it for this video. A lot of the music is just so relaxing, and tranquil, and zen-like. Seriously, one of the best OSTs I've ever heard from such a forgotten, overlooked game. Between that and the really pretty scenery, it just captures that ancient Asian atmosphere perfectly. There was a sequel to Kingdom of Paradise, but sadly, it never got released in English. Oh well, at least we got this game. Unlike most other older RPGs, and most of the other games on this list for that matter, this one is still actually surprisingly dirt cheap. You can find a complete copy on eBay for only like 10 to 15 bucks. While I'm not a wizard who can predict the future and definitely don't think it's going to get as expensive as some other old RPGs, I think it's a pretty safe bet to assume that it won't stay around these prices forever, so for all you physical game collectors out there, now's not a bad time to look into it. Also, I promise I'm not trying to artificially raise prices either. I only own one copy of the game and we're a channel with less than 20k subscribers, so don't have that big of a reach. I just think it's a good deal for those who like physical games. So, yeah, if this one looks appealing to you, check it out. The next game we have on our list is Suikoden V. The Suikoden series is loosely based on another one of China's 4 great classical novels, Water Margin. In that novel, it contains what is called the 108 Stars of Destiny, which, to sum it up, is just 108 people that come together for a common goal. Suikoden very heavily borrows from this concept, as each game features 108 party members for you to recruit to build an army and castle with. These are incredibly cool and unique components of a series that give it a lot of identity. With that said, you might be asking, why'd I decide on number 5 as the specific entry for this list? Well, in my opinion, based on the character design and some of the locations you go to, I think it might just feature the biggest Asian influence out of them all. Suikoden 1 and 2 are pretty close, but still, a good amount of those worlds are still more medieval fantasy based. Both the main characters in those games are more Asian martial artists in design, but in Suikoden 1 you start in a Victorian-like castle, and in Suikoden 2 you start in an army of soldiers and knights, so yeah, a little more fantasy based. To further iterate my point, just compare George Prime's design in Suikoden 2 to Suikoden 5. His design in 2 is a lot more traditional fantasy-like, whereas his design in 5 has much more Eastern Asian influence. And yeah, while 3 and 4 are good games, they stray pretty far from the Asian setting, so not really in consideration for this list. I've also talked about 1 and 2 a lot on the channel before, and I've yet to really talk about 5, so let's do that. Suikoden V was released for the PS2, and like all the other games in the series, was developed by Konami. In many ways, Suikoden V was like a return to roots in the Suikoden series, sorta like what Final Fantasy IX was to the series after 7 and 8. The Trinity system in 3 was quite different, along with how you paired up characters in battles, and Suikoden 4 only allowed 4 characters in your party compared to the 6 like in all the others. Suikoden 5 on the other hand though, no Trinity system, no character pairings, and back to a 6-person party. It was definitely one for the OG fans, you could say. Everything you know and love about the series is pretty much all here. Of course, there's castle building, 108 Stars of Destiny to recruit, and a really deep and engaging plot that some fans consider the best in the series. Honestly, the only thing I'm not a huge fan about in this game is the presentation. Character models do look pretty solid and definitely the best out of the PS2 games. It's just how the camera pans around towns and dungeons that I'm not really crazy about. It's always so far away and kind of like a bird's eye view, which creates a disconnect and lack of immersion. Really, environments as a whole are pretty plain, lack a lot of detail, and are probably the worst parts about this game, to be honest. If you can get past that though, then there's a really great game here. For all you story aficionados out there, the story in this one makes it worth playing alone. If you're curious to learn more about the Suikoden series in general, we did release a complete retrospective over the first game a couple months back, so check that one out if interested. It's my personal favorite in the series. Suikoden V is still an excellent game though, and I highly recommend it. Coming up next, we have Jade Empire. I know we normally cover JRPGs on this channel, but if you look at the title of this video, it does say RPGs and not JRPGs. So yeah, kinda making an exception here. It just felt wrong to make a video about ancient Asian RPGs and not include this one. It was developed by BioWare in their prime years and is one of their more underappreciated games, I think. It was initially released for the OG Xbox, but would later see a port to the PC, and is probably most easiest played on Steam these days. Jade Empire is another game in the style of the wuxia fantasy genre, taking place in a fictionalized version of mythical ancient China, and damn, is it one gorgeous game. It absolutely nails the setting, because it immerses you right in. In this game, you play as a spirit monk on a quest to save their master and stop an evil emperor. As with most other Western-designed RPGs, you get the option to customize your main character, choosing their appearance, gender, skills, and stuff like that. The game plays out like an open-world action RPG, however you do gain various party members along the way. Since this is a BioWare game, there's of course branching dialogue choices which do affect your morality, referred to as the way of the open palm or way of the closed fist in this game, some story scenes, and even the ending of the game. I think the lore in this game is super interesting overall, and it's only enhanced by the cool Chinese mythological elements and really pretty scenery. Combat-wise, Jade Empire is a bit more action-oriented than some other BioWare titles like Knights of the Old Republic and Dragon Age Origins, but it still should have enough role-playing elements to satisfy fans of the genre. There's a lot of variety with all the different fighting styles, and controls feel pretty tight, so it's a good time. So yeah, the game plays great, looks great, sounds great, and just is great. I think the game is still a lot of fun to play today, so if it's one you've always been curious about, I say check it out. Before we move on to the last entry on this list, I want to quickly go over some honorable mentions that didn't quite make the actual list for one reason or another. Breath of Fire 4. While this game probably could have fit this list, it doesn't really take place in true ancient Asia and just has a lot of inspiration in certain parts. Plus, we just released a full 40-minute retrospective over the game last week, so it just seemed kinda redundant to talk about it here for a couple minutes. It is an absolutely incredible game though, so check that video out if you want to hear my thoughts on it. Or Sheikah, Tainted Bloodlines. I probably mispronounced that, so my apologies. This looks like a pretty fun turn-based RPG for the Vita, with a lot of Japanese mythological elements, but I haven't played it, so I can't really talk about it. Pokémon Conquest. This is a really interesting strategy RPG crossover between the Pokemon series and the Nobunaga's Ambition series, and seems to take place in feudal Japan. I haven't played it either though, so yeah, I can't really say anything. It looks pretty cool though. Nintendo, Way of the Ninja. This is a pretty interesting turn-based RPG for the Super Nintendo, where you recruit people to your side to battle Nobunaga. Some people seem to enjoy this one, but I don't know, I just had a hard time getting into it. Graphically, it looks more like an NES game, which is gonna be a hard sell for some people. Speaking of NES games though, there's also Destiny of an Emperor. This game loosely follows the events of the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, another one of China's 4 great classical novels. It features branching storyline paths and a pretty different strategy battle system. On the topic of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, there's also a giant strategy franchise that shares that same name. This series is absolutely massive and is still going on to this day. They're just more real-time strategy games and not really RPGs. I thought it was at least worth a mention though. Adventures of Musashi. This one seems to be a pretty charming NES RPG in the style of Dragon Quest, just in a more traditional Japanese setting. Moving on to a similar name, we have Brave Fencer Musashi. I wanted to include this game so bad, but then I remembered that you only play as a samurai and are just transported to a more generic fantasy world. Well, not generic, just not traditional Japanese-like. It's a super charming and fun action RPG though, that was ahead of its time in a lot of ways. I'll just have to find another excuse to talk about this game in the future. And the last honorable mention that we have is Okami. This one isn't a true RPG and it's more of like a 3D Zelda action-adventure game, but there's no way I couldn't at least mention it. With that said, I do think it feels like more of an RPG than 3D Zeldas. There's a lot of towns to visit, NPCs to talk to, and battles even take place on a separate screen after running into enemies on the world map. That last part especially gives me JRPG vibes. As if it wasn't obvious by the footage, the game is spectacularly beautiful and is heavily influenced by Japanese mythology. The cel-shaded graphics hold up excellently and just make you feel like you're playing an interactive painting or piece of art. I really thought about bending the rules for this one and including it on the actual list, but I didn't want to include two Zelda-like games as some people would be like, dude, what the hell? Wait, what's that? This is the first Zelda-like game I've mentioned, you say? Ah, well, that brings us to the last game on the actual list then. Mystical Ninja starring Goemon. I've been trying to find an excuse to talk about this game on the channel forever now, so by God, if I see a slight opening, I'ma take it. Mystical Ninja, starring Goemon, was developed by Konami and came out for the Nintendo 64. It's a part of the super long-running Goemon franchise, which was largely not released outside of Japan. Out of the ones we did get in English though, this one has the most RPG-like elements. It's, coincidentally, by far my favorite one as well. I remember rinsing this game so much from Blockbuster back in the day until my parents finally just bought it for me. It might have actually even been my introduction to Japanese culture, at least the wackier, zanier humor part of it. It really was the start of me falling in love with the culture that would only be propelled by shows like Dragon Ball a little later on. But yeah, even back then, this was a pretty obscure game that I never really heard any one of my friends, or really just anyone, talk about. I sort of felt like I was a part of this exclusive club or something that not that many people knew about. I was like, yeah, Zelda's cool and all, but what you know about that Goemon though? Speaking of Zelda though, Ocarina of Time is most often the first game people compare this one to. However, with that said, I found it pretty interesting that Mystical Ninja actually came out first. So yeah, Nintendo, who's the Zelda clone now? With that said, while Mystical Ninja does contain some Zelda-like elements with the town and dungeon exploration, it still has a lot of differences as well. There's a lot more platforming for one, however the biggest difference is how you can play as 4 different characters in this game. There's our spiky-haired protagonist, Goemon, his lovable and little chunky partner, Abisumaru, the badass secret ninja with mermaid powers, Yai, and the mechanical ninja robot, Sasuke. Certainly one colorful and memorable cast of characters. After they actually join your party, you can seamlessly swap between the 4 of them whenever you want. They each have their own playstyles along with unique abilities you're going to have to make use of, and it's a lot of fun. I briefly touched upon it earlier, but another thing that makes this game stand out so much is the overall tone and humor of the story. I mean, just listen to the plot outline. In this game, you're trying to stop an eccentric group called the Peach Mountain Shoguns who are trying to turn Japan into a giant stage and its citizens into dancers. Yeah, it makes absolutely no sense, and I love it. It's super over the top in all the best ways, and even has a laugh track that plays at times, so you know the game doesn't take itself seriously. It's just a perfect embodiment of quirky, wacky Japanese humor. A dungeon made of sushi and other food? You got it. A bunch of buff dudes flexing in their underwear on the game over screen? Sure. A giant mecha fighting robot, complete with its own theme song? Dude, that's the best part about the game. There's segments in the game where you fight in first person, controlling the robot Impact, and they're so much fun. An epic theme song always plays out before these parts, and don't tell me it doesn't get you hyped. Bruh, this song slaps so hard. It almost makes me a little emotional after the breakdown part, as it just brings me back to simpler times. Watching this for the first time as a kid, I had no idea what the hell was going on, but still, I was completely enamored regardless. Overall, the music in this game is extremely catchy, as I've had numerous tracks stuck in my head since making this video. It captures the whimsical side of the Edo period perfectly. So yeah, with all that said, I think I've rambled about this one long enough now. It's just one of my favorite games ever, and I've always wanted to talk about it. Alright, and that about wraps up this video. Thanks for watching everyone, we hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please either consider hitting that like button, or subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. How do you guys feel about RPGs set in ancient Asian settings though? Do you have some favorites that I missed? Or do you also really like some of the games that I mentioned here? Let us know in the comments below. As always, just want to give a huge thanks to our Patreon supporters, and an extra special shout out to one of our top patrons, Jesse Spencer. We actually just hit our first milestone through there recently, which called for creating a Discord server, which we have gone ahead and done just that. It's been a chill place to talk about RPGs, video games, and really just anything. We very much appreciate the support in making it happen. Other than that, thanks again for watching everyone, and hope you have an awesome day. This is Corbin from Gaming Productions. Until next time.